The threat index is flashing red.
My guest today, Larry Henderson, spent years as an executive at the CIA. He's currently Director of Global Intelligence at Crisis 24. He shares how to stay safe as a traveler in times of conflict.
The State Department advisory might be the forum we're looking at the sea level.
The threat level at the upcoming World Cup games, what to do and what not to do when a country closes its airspace.
Sometimes evacuation isn't the best thing.
And a framework for vetting a country before you move there. If you know anyone traveling in the upcoming months or moving abroad, please share this with them. Larry, welcome to the Tourism Lens podcast. It is March 2026. What is the one thing that U.S. travelers should be paying attention to the most right now?
The thing they should be focused on is the speed of change and the unpredictability of the global geopolitical landscape. It's hard to really keep track of all the information that's out there, but to whatever extent you can, try to find reliable, consistent information on your location, on the travel routes, on the dynamism of this travel ecosystem, and be confident in that information.
You are actually Director of Global Intelligence at Crisis 24. What is Crisis Intelligence and who do you do this work for?
Yeah, absolutely. We're an intelligence-led organization that does travel risk management for Fortune 500 companies. We do mass communications, critical events, personal solution protection type services as well. And obviously, it's a very dynamic geopolitical landscape, and we support businesses who do that type of global trade around the world.
And it's mostly American companies?
Actually, it's international. We have American clients, but clients all over the world. Those doing business in the U.S., but also, again, all parts of the world. It's a very diverse clientele.
So it's real-time data that you're looking at daily?
Correct. Yeah, we have, I'd say, arguably the largest number of private sector intelligence analysts in this area, and we're looking at real-time information, social media, a variety of open source, publicly available media outlets. We also leverage our own on-the-ground group of security professionals across the globe, and they give us that very important local ground truth insight that we marry up with the real-time information we get from other public sources.
I was curious about that because I know data is one thing, but then there's the cultural interpretation.
Yeah, you make a great point, Lily. In this business, you have to really understand the cultural context, the kind of local dynamics, and you can't just be behind a computer screen. We pride ourselves with a lot of our analysts being world travelers, if you will, speak the local language, understand the real cultural dynamics and fabric of what makes a country, a community, a city tick, and then marry that up with the type of media that we pull together so that we can create that real-time, what we call actionable insight, so that decision makers, be they C-suite executives or family members looking at going abroad, can make those decisions with confidence as they look at their choices on where they want to travel.
You actually grew up abroad, right? I think I read that you grew up.
Yeah, you do your research. Yeah, my mother's actually British. My father is American from Chicago, and I grew up as a military brat. I lived in England for about 7 years, Spain for 5, Germany for 3.5. So I very much believe in understanding local context and getting to know the communities you live in. So it's part of a give back as well as understand and capitalize on all the advantages of living abroad. And I take that into what my team does here at Crisis 24 when we try to deliver to our clients what it really feels like on the ground. The risk is everywhere, but it's also being wide-eyed, being humble about where we sit in this ecosystem.
Let's dig into that. There's the war in the Middle East. There's the narco blockades that just erupted. In Mexico, in Guadalajara, Puerto Vallarta, a major tourist destination. And then you're seeing domestically federal immigration agents taking over the TSA. It feels like chaos for you as a professional. Does right now feel any different from other dangerous periods that you've monitored throughout your career?
It does. It is. It's a different period. So I think all of us have to be honest about that. It's a more polarized period. Geopolitics is a lot more transactional, and technology really undergirds and makes the dynamics that we're confronting so extremely fast. So those three pillars converge to make us entering a very unpredictable period of time. And that's why I mentioned at the kickoff to try to really do your research and be confident in the information you have, understand your risk position, what you're willing to risk, and enter airports with a degree of confidence, but understanding things can move very quickly.
Crisis 24 has a global risk forecast that they put out every year. I recommend everybody download it. It predicted actually the renewal of Iran-Israel hostilities, and although not the U.S. involvement part, I don't think. For regular travelers, how should we perceive safety abroad this year based on the report?
Yeah, as I alluded to, just the fragmented information space, which is being bombarded by misinformation and disinformation. I think that rings true. As analysts, as practitioners in the intelligence field, it's hard to really work through the noise. That is an important concept to think about as you're looking at, again, information streams and the safety environment that you're entering. I mentioned the polarization, and that hits at home, as we know. And that polarization is not just in the United States. There's a number of countries across the globe. At Crisis 24, we consider the polarization and the transactional nature as structural. It is how business is being done across nation states, and it transcends into communities and local governments as well. Germany, for example, when it comes to the rise of the right and the AfD party and what that means for migration. I could go on, Lily.
West Africa, I think I saw in the report about Burkina Faso or Mali.
Yeah, the Sahel is a region that we've flagged with the rise of militancy. Africa is interesting just from a demographic perspective as well. The youth are very vocal, frustrated with the lack of reliable governance and the inequity there. We've seen Gen Z protest movements that have occurred. Tanzania is an example. And I mentioned Tanzania because obviously that's a tourist site when it comes to Zanzibar, and you can be insulated on a resort, for example. However, just across the water, you have very public protest around an election that cause a lot of controversy. Again, you can be insulated, but that does impact your ability to depart across borders or travel as well. So those are a number of different examples that I think reflect the polarization, the transactional nature, as well as the technology piece.
That's so interesting to me because I have seen that, especially in West Africa. There's a growing anti-Western, anti-US as a result of so much history we can't go into now.
If I could, on that, obviously with some of the decision making around USAID or funding that has an impact on real life issues of local communities, as well as great power competition and what does that mean for other nation states that are competing for influence, such as China, for example. And we're seeing a lot more when it comes to some of the Gulf states and their activity in Africa. So that has left a vacuum, and we're seeing that play out on the ground in terms of competing priorities.
Larry, I want to get your take on this. I was in Istanbul early March.
I love Istanbul. But
yeah, okay. Was not too worried before going. My antenna was a little bit up, but everything was normal. And then the next day is when the news came out of a missile that had hit in the south of Turkey near an airbase. And I stayed up that night looking up plan B just in case airspace shut down. And I found that I could take a bus to the Greek border. Was I being paranoid or smart?
No, I think you're smart. You read the signals. It goes back to things can move relatively quickly. It sounds like you weren't tracking that this might occur, which makes sense. But at the same time, you had enough wits about you to read the tea leaves and look at options. And that's something I think tourists should take a page from your book in terms of how to approach these type of potentially crisis situations.
Should I have done that before the trip?
Probably. That's what we would advise. And so, so you're teasing out of me. But obviously, if I could juxtapose for the businesses we support, there's a duty of care obligation, if you will. And so there's a built-in continuous review of the situation on the ground. We would be working with travelers in advance to understand their hotels and have a good sense of their evacuation options. But again, for a tourist, we would suggest perhaps a little bit more rigor in advance.
Without naming names, can you give us an example of when you actually were able to do that for a client to predict? We saw Dubai, where so many people were caught off guard. Is that a good example of where you would predict ahead of time and get them?
Yeah. Predicting is always, that word makes me nervous sometimes. But there is an element, both in the case of Iran and Tanzania, for example, we were able to provide advance warning. We were confident in our assessment, for example, that the negotiations prior to the launch of missiles from both Israel and the United States were likely going to fall apart. And we were able to communicate that to our clients. We had been tracking this since the beginning of the year in December. And as you suggested, even in our global risk forecast, we could tell at that time that Israel was looking at things in a more kinetic perspective. And this has translated obviously to where we are today. You were correct also in suggesting that at that time, meaning in 2025, as we close out the year, we did not anticipate that the U.S. would be in this fight, if you will. However, we got through negotiations, saw some things in terms of movement of troops, some messaging, and we were able to provide that type of warning.
Okay. So following that trip to Turkey, when I came back, the State Department actually updated literally a few days later saying Americans should stay out of of South Turkey, and the advisory went up to 4. So I was thinking, does this mean that even government advisories come a little bit late, just a few days?
I'll start by saying how important they are. For travelers, we look at them as a nice baseline, and they have a different approach in that they will often provide that information after the fact. And that's important, though, because sometimes even after the fact is more timely than an average tourist might have been observing the entire landscape. At Crisis 24, we're complementary. So I don't want to say we're better than, or et cetera, but we're complementary in terms of an information stream in that we're looking at it from a real-time perspective. And we're ideally providing that advanced warning, that advanced signal. The State Department advisory might be the floor, and we're looking at the sea, like where can we go from here? And we also will tailor our insight for the particular clients and customers, whereas the State Department advisories are a little bit more restrained in that they're looking at a wider audience. And for them, accuracy is very important. And not that it's not the same for us, but we want to give that real-time information to our clients.
They actually have briefings, country intelligence briefings online, if you wanted to go further from the advisory. I certainly read them. And I know that in terms of knowing the specificity, like which region to stay away from within a country, as opposed to just generalizing the entire country not being safe, that's helpful. But I do think that there's also a lot of skepticism when it comes to State Department advisories. Some people see them as a political tool.
If I could, you mentioned the OSAC, the acronym is OSAC. Those are great briefings online for those who want a little bit more detail.
Yes, the State Department did issue a worldwide caution March 22. Is that too broad? People who see that might even not travel at all. How do you interpret that? Are we staying away from tourist sites?
This almost certainly is emanating from the crisis in the Middle East. I'll say the threat index is flashing red. There are credible threats out there emanating from Iran and sympathizers. It would more likely than not be lone wolf actors, inspired actors who will more likely than not target soft targets if and when they decide to do so. We've seen some of that already around synagogues, perhaps in the Middle East, pro-U.S. facilities or perceived to be pro-U.S. facilities. So it is credible signals, but I think you suggested this. People should also live their life, be aware of the threat and be very cognizant, but at the same time, don't let the threat dictate how you live, where you travel, and how you approach life. Much like you, I often look at exits, for example. Where am I dining, or just understanding in terms of like exit and entry.
I do that at the movie theater, so.
Yeah, same here. We have had some incidents, not terrorist related or threat related, but that have been, as you mentioned, ICE and airports, but be flexible. Think about your transition locations and routes, make sure you have enough space as well when it comes to your time. Think about alternative routes, for example.
And maybe it's also avoiding crowded events.
Yeah, we are looking at the World Cup. And you mentioned the killing of El Mencho in Guadalajara and what that means. So we do think that is a heightened threat environment. I'm a huge soccer fan,
huge soccer fan.
But at the same time, given the geopolitical events and the climate and the events in the Middle East, I think, yes, attend and just be aware of your environment. And again, look at those exit routes, be cognizant of enough time to get through security, those type of things.
Exit routes from the stadium, wherever you are.
Yeah, the fallout from the most recent cartel killing is still to be played out. I think there's an interest in the cartels to ensure that tourism can proceed, that they're a money-making endeavor, and disrupting an event of that scale. Again, it's not to say that it wouldn't happen, but it would have repercussions that could further impact their ability to generate profits from the type of business that they do. And so far, the dust has settled. We're monitoring it closely. And that's not to say that Mexico is any more dangerous than the United States or Canada. Just the World Cup in general, much like the Olympics, these big events do bring that type of attention that, again, say a lone wolf actor would find an attractive target.
The Crisis 24 report mentions activists likely to hold demonstrations, possibly at World Cup events. I thought that was a good thing to look out for.
Yeah, for sure. And then we're looking also, for example, as recently as this weekend in a lot of major cities in the United States, the No Kings protests. The protests generally are peaceful. It's getting caught in the crosshairs if something were to erupt or, again, just transit. So we look at it more from that perspective as opposed to these being events.
Let's talk about Americans abroad. Tens of thousands of them have been leaving the U.S. in the past couple of years, and they're going to fairly similar places: Ghana, Portugal, Mexico, Colombia. If you are advising somebody today who's moving abroad, looking for a place with less risk of a looming in crisis, what does that vetting process look like?
First of all, I'd long to do that myself one day. So I'm looking forward to Yeah, I look at a couple things. I want to look at the political stability, generally speaking, because a lot starts from the top. That dictates the judicial system, the security system, the mood of the population. And that's why I'm starting there. I want to understand the political infrastructure and the tone of that particular government and the opposition. So I'm looking at that from a macro level. And then from there, to what extent corruption's everywhere. So I don't want to be Pollyannish that there isn't corruption, but understanding the corruption index, and because that will impact your day-to-day life. Are you in a country that you unfortunately have to bribe to get a little medical care? And again, that exists. Or is this a rule of law state, not on the pendulum where kind of a dictatorial rule of law, but does the justice system function? So I'd be looking at nation state, that political infrastructure. I'd be looking at the degree of corruption that exists within a spectrum, the legal system, as well as crime statistics. And I think all of us do that when we're moving into a community, be it Northeast DC or Los Angeles. You're never going to eliminate crime, but what does that look like? I'd also look at, again, I alluded to medical care and what that access is. Are you going to a Denmark or Norway? And if so, what does that mean for a U.S. citizen? If you're in a little riskier geographic region, transit routes, roads, as we start thinking about, I mentioned Zanzibar, Tanzania, how fast things could change. I've been in locations where, say, I've lived in the Balkans, quite frankly, those one-lane roads going up a mountain.
To get out.
Yeah. When I talk about transit routes, it's also the border requirements. What countries are you arrayed against? And what type of documentation do you need? But also, how often has that shifted in the past year? Are there some arbitrary adjustments that might have occurred on a kind of a given crisis? So I look at the crisis tempo. What else?
I tend to do this as a reporter. Even when I report on tourism from a conscious lens, I keep track of social sentiment. What are people saying online about certain big things that are happening in the news in that country? I look at locals' comments and obviously grain of salt, but to some extent, I think they really reflect how people feel about what's happening in the country or about the government. And that would impact quality of life, I think.
Absolutely. I'd be remiss. You hit the nail on the head. I think you have to be able to do that. It's akin to, and you've probably seen this when you get off the airplane and you're in with the cab driver and he or she has stories to tell. That's like the best nugget of information there. If you can also translate that into the social media sphere. And I think, again, I mentioned some more big muscle movement type things, but you're absolutely right. You need that fabric, that sense of mood, because that speaks volumes. And then it also suggests how dynamics might change on the ground, be it civil protest, civil unrest, strikes, for example, as we know often happens in France. So I think that's so important.
Are there regions that are a safe bet anymore?
I don't want to say the world is such a dangerous place. So that's not the case. But you just have to be aware, flexible, and prepared. Those three things. And you think about the unfortunate incident that happened in Australia. We had the incident with the father and son shooting. So there's incidents where you think this could never happen. And fortunately, things have happened.
There's a myth that when things hit the fan, the U.S. Embassy will come and send a helicopter and the Marines and you'll be rescued immediately. But as we've seen in several cases in the past, it's not necessarily as immediate as we might want it to be. What can you actually count on when something happens and the country closes the airspace? What's the right thing to do as an American on the ground?
Yeah, you raise a really good point. We're seeing this play out in the Middle East now, and we had, unfortunately, a number of U.S. citizens stuck. Definitely register with the embassy. That is very important. And it's a case-by-case situation depending on the event that might be occurring. And I say U.S. Embassy, but for your viewers who are from any other nationality, definitely for your own embassy, please do register. There is ideally a communication stream that does happen. We mentioned the advisories, and perhaps it might be a little bit late, but it's nice to just make sure you have any and all information at your tip so you can help make decisions. The other piece in a crisis, again, much like we're seeing in the Gulf and the Middle East as a result of Iran, Israel, U.S., there's so much confusion. I would suggest pause, because sometimes evacuation isn't the best thing, especially in the immediacy of a crisis. Take stock of your options. Again, this is moving quickly, so I'm not saying pause for a long time, but just
pause while the drones are coming down.
Yeah. Pause and consider consider within a reasonable time frame, but it's not always run for the door because the door might be blocked or there could be another piece of threat or danger emanating from that door. And when I say the door might be locked, it could be, again, the airports of Dubai are shut down or the corridors are made more narrow, so you have significant delays. You were going to ask me something, Lily?
I was going to say, is it a mistake when we've seen even in the Dubai case, some people panic and get out by ground to a neighboring country? And I personally can imagine doing that in the immediate moment, but then I don't know what it's like. They're going to Saudi or they're going to, you don't know what you're going to encounter on the way. It just seemed very risky to me. Would you have done that?
Probably not. No. And just to pull back the curtain a little bit on how we approach it on a daily basis at Crisis 24 with the ongoing conflict, we literally have a call every morning and we go over the various routes. We talk about the type of documentation that's required, what observations have we seen at this particular location, to what extent the specific airlines are reaching out to passengers who are still stuck in Dubai at their hotel, what it takes to get them out to the airport and out. Do we need to charter planes? Again, we have the benefit of being a rather large organization supporting companies. I think tourists can do some of the same in terms of finding out as best they can what is a reliable route. It could be from friends who have traversed that particular area or talking to reliable sources at the hotel. Again, looking at some of those government-related announcements. UAE prides itself on its tourist industry. Even in this, has quite an impressive risk tolerance given the incoming that we've seen. So it tries to put an air of normalcy. And so it's just important to think about government communications, not to say it's not all factual, but there is a reason why, and I think you even mentioned the State Department that can have a political tint. You have to work through that, understand some of the motivations of the messaging, and find reliable sources that can help inform your decision making as you look at exit strategies.
Is there a metric that tells us before something happens? Is it maybe supermarket shelves are empty or military's on the corner of the street?
Yeah, I think part of the joke in the intelligence community is you could look at how many pizza deliveries are happening at the Pentagon. And if they're getting a lot of pizza, there might be some planning. Anyway, any good organization will have indicators of escalation, of pathways. In the Middle East, we've crossed that now a few times. As recently as today, we looked at what we're calling an escalation inflection point. Right now, all signals are pointing towards continued escalation, both messaging as well as action as we look at, for example, the Marine amphibious units moving towards the region. We can, for example, look at the rate of GPS spoofing when it comes to the airspace environment. GPS spoofing is basically falsifying the location of, say, a maritime vessel or an aircraft, so you essentially get lost or you're not sure how to get to your target. We're seeing it used a little bit more regularly in the Middle East conflict. Highly skilled pilots, but it adds a layer of complexity to getting in and out of a particular airport. We can look at maritime space, obviously border closures. So there are those type of indicators that can give us a sense for whether or not we advise, because again, it's ultimately the client's decision, but advise that now might be the time to move.
What is the one potential crisis right now that's keeping you up at night that the rest of us don't even consider yet?
This is a huge one, and it has reverberations globally. A few things. Cuba worries me only because of U.S. intent, what I would call coming out of Venezuela, this idea of a military victory high, although some of that might have been tarnished based on what we're seeing in Iran. But a tactic could be perceived as had worked in Venezuela. That tactic doesn't seem to be working in Iran, but perhaps there's a playbook that can be scripted in Cuba. And obviously, it's already impacting local population when you look at the blockade, the humanitarian crisis that's occurring, the energy issues that are occurring, and a key restraint might be the migration fallout into the United States. Another one that's out there is Ethiopia and Eritrea.
Yes.
It continues to loom. It has broader ramifications beyond Ethiopia and Eritrea. We're looking at that closely, having conversations about the possibility of escalation there.
Ethiopia's push for Red Sea access.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then I'm actually concerned about the terrorist threat. Keeps me up in terms of how and if that might manifest. Cuba from a geopolitical, Ethiopia a kind of regional, and also how that might spread even in that area. And then the underlying prospect of a more significant terrorist threat are probably three things that I'm looking at and concerned about.
Larry, thank you so much. It's been really informative. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Lily. Appreciate it.